December 23, 2022. A lone police officer walks deep into the Lake Jackson forest, led by two men who say they found their friend's body. 50 yards down a narrow trail, a blue tarp lies in the dirt. The officer pulls it back. Beneath it is a naked man face down in a pool of blood, his skin cut and bruised. Something moves in the trees. Someone still out there. The killer, watching, waiting. In the next 48 hours, investigators will uncover a tale of paranoia, violence, and torture, ending with one of the most disturbing autopsy reports they've ever seen. Wherever you're watching, hit subscribe and like.
The call came in just after noon on December 23, 2022. A distressed man on the line, his voice shaking, telling dispatch he'd found his best friend dead in the Lake Jackson forest. Within minutes, Officer Azor was pulling into the trailhead. Two men were waiting, Jamie, the 911 caller, and Robert, both agitated, urgent. "Come on," Robert said. "We'll show you." It was a risky decision, following strangers deep into the woods without backup, but the circumstances left little choice. The officer radioed in his location. 389, I'm 1012 with them. Just give me a minute. Heading down to take a look. The trail twisted under the canopy, the smell of damp earth heavy in the air. They were only about 50 yards in when Robert stopped and pointed. There. A blue tarp lay sprawled across the dirt. Something about the way it sagged told the officer this wasn't covering firewood or camping gear. He knelt, lifted a corner, and froze. Underneath was the naked body of a man, face down, surrounded by a dark halo of blood. The skin was pale, mottled, streaked with cuts and scrapes. This was no simple death in the woods. Jamie's story came out in short bursts, how they'd walked by earlier, seen their friend, James Ladendecker, lying like this, how they'd found a knife nearby, how Robert had picked it up. The officer made a note. That detail would matter later. "We're going to need your fingerprints," the officer told him. "Not accusing you of anything. You just have to be ruled out." But there was no time to linger. Something wasn't right. That's when the forest answered back. A rustle, east of his position. Not a squirrel, not the wind. Something moving through the underbrush, deliberate. "I'm not sure if it's a person, but I've got movement east of my location," he whispered into the radio. "Sounds like it's heading this way." Alone, crouched over a murder victim, the thought hit him. What if the killer is still here, watching from behind the trees? Relief came with the crunch of boots on leaves, backup arriving. The air felt less heavy now, but the unease didn't fade. With more officers on scene, they began to take stock. The tarp was soaked with blood. A knife lay near the victim's left hand, no blood visible on the blade, but the handle smeared with dirt. A makeshift camp spread out deeper in the trees, tents, scattered belongings, a fire pit. One of the officers leaned in. "He's cold to the touch," he said flatly. "This is fresh." Another voice cut in. "There's two people who live here. One's here, one's outstanding." It meant one thing. Someone was missing. And in a murder scene like this, missing almost always means running. Then came the details that made even seasoned cops exchange looks. The victim's body bore signs of brutal violence, blunt force trauma to the head, ligature marks on the neck, and something else. The smell. Acrid, chemical, gasoline. Gasoline in the lungs, gasoline in the stomach, gasoline splashed across his skin. The implication was as horrifying as it was clear. Someone had tried to burn him alive. Whoever had done this wasn't just a killer. They were cruel, calculated, and still, maybe, in these very woods.
By the time the body was secured and the perimeter marked off, the woods had fallen into an uneasy silence, but the scene still crackled with tension. The smell of gasoline lingered, clinging to everything. The victim's body was wrapped and sent to the coroner's office, but his presence, it stayed behind. The officers began their next task: find out who James Decker's last moments were spent with. And it didn't take long before one name started rolling off every witness's tongue: Dusty. Jamie, the 911 caller, went first. He insisted he'd only stumbled upon the body, but when pressed, his tone shifted. "You want to know who did this? Dusty McDonald. Lives right up there. This morning, he came down with a hatchet, threatened to chop people up. Sheriff's department came, but they didn't get him. James was the one he was looking for." Robert, the second witness, told nearly the same story. They both described hearing arguing earlier in the day, Dusty shouting, James on the ground. The words were angry, threatening. "Shouldn't have been talking shit," Dusty had told him, pinning him down. But to the people watching from a distance, it just looked like another camp argument. They left it alone. Hours later, James would be dead under that tarp. Every officer knew that in a transient camp like this, rumors traveled fast, and truth was often tangled in grudges. But this was different. Nearly everyone they questioned pointed straight to Dusty. It wasn't just the fight that day. Dusty had a history here, a violent reputation. He was the kind of man who carried 3 or 4 knives at a time, like a soldier in a war no one else could see. He liked control, and when people didn't follow his rules, they paid for it. The officers compared notes. Earlier that morning, they'd already heard Dusty's name in a completely separate call. A man named Rick had called 911, claiming Dusty had slashed his tent with a machete. Rick said Dusty was looking for James then, too. That detail snapped into place like the last piece of a puzzle. The hatchet threats, the machete, the fight, and now James was dead under that tarp. Statements piling up, the decision was made. Find Dusty McDonald and bring him in. His address wasn't hard to come by. He lived nearby, on property owned by his grandfather, close enough to the camps to keep a watchful, controlling eye. A team assembled quickly, surrounding the house, ready to move in. When Dusty stepped out, the officers closed in. "I don't have anything in my hands," he called out, his voice strangely casual. "Turn around, put your hands behind your back," an officer ordered. Dusty obeyed, but his words were bizarre. "Man tried to light me on fire down there. Y'all know what happened." If this was an attempt at a self-defense claim, it was clumsy, almost rehearsed. He kept insisting James was the aggressor, that the gasoline was his doing. But to the officers, it sounded more like someone trying to preemptively explain away a murder scene. With Dusty in custody, detectives shifted focus to building the case. The witnesses had given them the who, but they needed the how and why. Interviews with camp residents painted a disturbing picture. Dusty often played the part of a benefactor, offering showers, laundry, food, but always at a cost. He controlled access, decided who stayed and who left. And when someone crossed him, things turned ugly fast. "He's violent," Jamie told them bluntly. "You don't do what he says, he gets mad. Always has a weapon on him. Always." By the end of the day, one thing was certain. If Dusty hadn't done this, then every single person in that camp was wrong. The odds of that? Almost none. The next step would be to sit Dusty down in an interview room and see if his own words could finish the case the witnesses had already started. When Dusty McDonald sat down in the interview room, there was no fear in his eyes, no tension in his shoulders. If anything, he seemed almost relaxed. Detectives started with the basics.
What happened in the woods that day? Why his name kept coming up? How gasoline had ended up in the lungs and stomach of James Decker. Dusty leaned forward and, with total seriousness, said, "You know I'm an owl, right?" The detectives exchanged a glance. This wasn't bravado. It was delusion. From there, the conversation twisted into a maze of paranoia and scattered thoughts. Dusty spoke about being watched, about having photographic and audiogenic abilities. He said he had a beautiful mind and sometimes felt like a god. And then, buried inside the rambling, something slipped out, something detectives seized on. That was my first. I think everybody knows that I'm me. To get that. Was he admitting to killing James? Or was it just more of the nonsensical stream pouring out of him? The line between confession and madness was razor thin. Detectives let him keep talking, hoping he'd trip over the truth. Dusty described experimenting in his house, practicing with knives, and said James had thrown gas on him. That, he claimed, was why the gasoline was there. But the crime scene told a different story. James had been beaten, strangled, burned, and forced to inhale gasoline before he died. It was torture, not a fight for survival. Still, Dusty clung to his narrative, insisting he was the victim. "That man tried to light me on fire," he repeated. "Y'all know what happened down there." The autopsy report shattered his version. James had suffered massive blunt force trauma to the face, neck, and torso. Fractured ribs, a broken hyoid bone, internal bleeding. His skin was burned in patches. Gasoline wasn't just on his clothes. It was on his skin, in his lungs, in his stomach. These were the injuries of a man attacking someone. They were the marks of prolonged, deliberate cruelty. But Dusty didn't flinch when confronted with the evidence. He didn't show guilt. Didn't ask about James. His final question to detectives was almost surreal. Will I be able to go home, or are we going down to dance? The detective stared at him. We're going to have to figure that out. By the end of the interview, there was nothing left to figure out. The witness accounts, the forensic evidence, and Dusty's own scattered words painted a clear picture. James Decker's final hours were a nightmare, and Dusty McDonald was at the center of it. Dusty was charged with first-degree murder. As of now, the case is still ongoing, but one thing is certain. In the Lake Jackson forest that day, death didn't come quietly. It came slow. It came cruel. And it came at the hands of a man who either couldn't or wouldn't understand the gravity of what he had done.
James Decker's death was not a moment. It was an ordeal. Beaten, strangled, doused in gasoline. His final hours were a descent into cruelty most of us can't even imagine. And the man accused of it, sitting in an interrogation room, talking about being an owl. Whether Dusty McDonald truly believed his own story, or whether it was all an act, one fact remains. Someone in that forest made sure James didn't walk out alive. The Lake Jackson woods are quiet now, but for the people who live there, the silence doesn't mean safety. If this story gripped you, share it, so James's name is never forgotten. And wherever you're watching, hit subscribe, tap like, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next case.